Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at this. This is a 2007 Yamaha FJR1300. It's considered a sport touring machine, but originally back in the day, Yamaha considered this a hyper sports touring machine. Let's find out a little bit about this particular FJR. It makes about 141 horsepower and about 99 pounds of torque. It weighs 637 pounds wet. In the front, you have a 17-inch front wheel, dual front rotors, and the brakes are excellent on it. This one does have ABS as well. And suspension on this is pretty hard. It does feel like a proper sport bike when you ride it. This particular bike has been down and it's got a little rash here and on the mirror. But otherwise, the bike is in really great shape. And you know, when you compare this to the SD1300, the SD has some crash bars that help it in case of things like this. You know, these bikes are not meant to be dropped, so there's always going to be some plastic damage when that happens. This is the typical Yamaha headlight look. Even the Yamaha Majesty has got this look. These kind of look like little eyebrows or eyelashes. I particularly don't like this sort of shape, but in the Yamaha Majesty, for example, it tends to look a little bit on the feminine side. I wish with the styling of the Yamaha that they made the headlights just a little bit more angular instead of like these kind of round shapes. Signals are built into the sides. They don't have the stalks. Even though these mirrors are not as nice as the Honda STs, they are extremely effective and they do not vibrate very much. It is a much nicer design than most of the mirrors that you would just get online. It is very robust. You can adjust your mirror here. You don't have to, move this around. These little vents that go right into the side on both of the headlights, there's these little vents. Things I appreciate about the Yamaha is that it's easy to maintain for a home mechanic. You have a lot of accessibility, including the water pump is right over there. You don't have to remove much plastics at all. And you do have this bolt that you could possibly use for a crash bar, because if you ever drop the bike, this is going to break. But the plastic is very streamlined. This bike is not wide like many of the sport touring machines. Left side, you have an extremely robust engine. I love seeing engines on motorcycles, and this looks pretty darn well designed for an engine. So starting off here, you have this cover, you have the plastic. It's very minimal. Normally you would have these sport touring machines that would push out the plastic a little bit more, and that does a couple of things. It protects the rider from the wind. This one does have some protection. You fit your legs through here, but normally the SD1300 Concours have just a little bit more plastic that comes out, and that gets the wind flowing around the rider a little bit more than this one. And look at this. This is an amazing thing that I love. That's the oil filter. Now, this is a sport touring machine. If this was an adventure bike, you might run into problems because it does stick out quite a bit from this bottom plastic. But imagine, that is probably one of the easiest oil changes you could possibly do with the oil filter. I absolutely love it there. And in between the filter and this crankcase, you have the oil sight glass, which has got a high mark and a low mark. I love the sight glasses. Sometimes you get dipsticks on bikes, and I just, if you're a manufacturer, just put the sight glass. It's so much easier. And then you have the fill, the oil fill, which is right there. Going on to this side, you have a adjustment here, which is hard and soft for the rear shock. And there is no adjustability. It's just like a hard or soft. Even the way this shock is, it's extremely hard for me. If you put the bike on the center stand, you do have a handle here that you can use to push up. I usually just use the grab rails of the bike itself. And of course, it comes with two saddle cases. Yamaha actually doesn't recommend you to put a top box on FJRs, which is kind of strange because every FJR owner has one and they ride with it perfectly fine. When you remove these saddle cases, this bike looks great. It looks like a sport bike, like a large sport bike. To open it, you turn it, and then you lift up on here. the build quality is not great. I have to admit, even on the first FJR I had, the build quality was not great. But you do pull this up, and this kind of slides open. One of the things I really don't like is the side loading saddlebags. I know that people love them, and I think it's because you can kind of put a full-size helmet in there. To remove this, you put in your key, you lift it up this way. So when you do that, it goes onto those latches. The way this works is as soon as you lift this up, that locks. And this is just a little plastic thing, not even metal, but it keeps the weight low, and it seems to be very effective. So when you talk about build quality, it's things like this. When you kind of slide this down, it's not very fluid, it feels cheap. That's the quality of the touring of the FJR. It's not great top of the line finishes like this. That's something that you appreciate a whole lot more about BMW and Honda. Honda, for example, puts a lot more effort into things that are mechanical and require a little bit more engineering. This is one of the reasons I really like the FJR. It looks great with it without the saddlebags. This bike just looks like a sport bike. When you remove those saddle cases, you can go riding in the twisties with your friends. You don't have to look as goofy, but the bike looks great with the bags, and it looks great without the bags. And I can't say the same thing about the ST, which only looks good with the bags on. One of the reasons you would want a Yamaha FJR, that's a extremely reliable shaft drive. And if you're thinking about, hey, maybe I'll get a Hayabusa because I really like speed, but I don't want to have to maintain a chain, well, the FJR is really that perfect bike for Hayabusa riders, for example, that like the hyper competitive nature of motorcycles. This one has got the titanium MIUU. Never heard of that exhaust, but it does sound good, and it's got a very distinct shape. The rear wheel is also a 17-inch rear wheel, single rotor on the right, and this particular bike does eat tires. It's got quite a bit of power, and it is heavy, which means that you're going to be spending a lot of money on tires. But luckily you don't have to spend much on maintenance because this bike just requires oil changes and not much else. You do have your passenger foot pegs here, very simple stuff. In the rear you have your brake lights and your signals integrated into one, so I do like this quite a bit. And it's got a little bit of an aggressive styling. Even the rack goes with the flow of the design of the bike. So design-wise, this bike looks great. It's one of the best looking sport touring machines in my opinion. I love that it's got this silver streak that just goes straight angular and goes up like that. It feels like it's an aggressive design, and for good reason. This bike does feel aggressive when you're riding. You don't feel like you're riding a sport touring machine. And the engine on this, it's a 4-cylinder. It makes 140 plus horsepower and is good for 150 miles per hour plus. That's an incredible value considering that these early gen FJRs, the first gen, you can get it for $2,000 something, maybe $3,000. This particular one, maybe $4,000. That's an incredible value. And the FJR1300, the resale value is higher because people appreciate the sporty nature of this bike compared to some other sport touring machines. You don't get this bike because it's an old man bike. It's a exciting bike to ride. If you are coming from a sport bike and you're thinking about doing some longer rides, this is not going to feel too different than a regular sport bike. Sure, you'll feel that weight, and it is a heavier bike on the top, and that's something that Yamaha did a little bit of a mistake, is putting weight up top. When you think about the SD1300, it weighs more, but the weight is lower on the end on the bike rather than on the top. Up here you have a gas tank that's like 6 gallons of fuel, and it's very high up, as you can tell. One of the big differences that you would find on this bike is that you kind of sit on top of the bike rather than in the bike. And that's the way I feel while riding it. Even in corners, it feels just a little bit quirkier than a lot of bikes. It doesn't feel as stable and confidence inspiring going around corners like some other bikes like the Concourse. It's stock. It does have like these ripples in the driver's seat. One of the things that you're going to find in my case, this bike makes so much power. The seat is in good shape except for those ripples, is that even with the texture, this grippy texture, when you accelerate, you get thrown back into the seat, at least in my case. And you can see the texture on this. The seat is completely perfect. Something you appreciate about a lot of the Japanese bikes, especially if you store them inside, the seats never really get damaged. It's only when you start putting things outside that they get damaged. But I love the two-seat option that they have. Left side, you have a pocket. And in this pocket, it only works when you turn on the ignition. The Honda ST1300, for example, it doesn't have an electronic button. So this is a very high-tech thing for the year of this bike. The SD had a key. You have to put the key in there and then turn it and open it up. But it was nice that it was a lockable pocket. To open it, you have to put the key in the ignition, turn it to the on position, push the button, and it releases. I mean, just look at that. That's well done. I don't know if you can tell, but I mean, it is tiny. It's kind of deep, but not deep enough that you can even put a hat or anything larger than an iPhone. It does have a adjustable or a 12-volt accessory right there. On this, you have very easy to adjust headlight level, and I prefer the manual adjustment like this rather than an electric one because it keeps the weight lower. And one thing I found is that once you adjust your headlights, you don't have to adjust them that much. You might have to do it maybe once a year. Let's look at the left side controls. You have a very typical Japanese control system. Headlights, high beams, turn signals, push in to cancel, horn. Then you have electric windshield. When your clutch is hydraulic, very easy to pull. Right side control, you have your front brake, throttle. The throttle on this is pretty hard. Then you have a hazard button, which is kind of odd. It's like an odd position for hazards. I've never seen this before. This is just a Yamaha thing. And then you have your starter. The buttons are really antiquated. You have two headlights. You have adjustment for each of the individual headlights. Left side, you have your tachometer, and it revs up pretty high, 11,000 RPMs. I did a much better job designing the dash on the second gen than on the first. The first looks terrible. This one is a step up. But I believe even the ST1300's dash, even though a little bit more antiquated with the analog dashes, looks better than this one. But you do have a nice digital dash here, and it has plenty of information that you would want. Look at the information here. First, you have a miles per gallon calculator. You have your fuel gauge, you have your temperature gauge, you have a gear indicator, which is really handy to have. You know, on this with 5 gears, it's not like you don't know what gear you're in, but it's still nice. And then you have a clock. And then 2 buttons here. This one's got 46,776 miles. And trip 1, trip 2, odometer. And then you have this button that cycles the miles per gallon, 41 miles per gallon average, which is better than a lot of sport touring machines, even despite for the amount of horsepower that you have. Air temperature today is a warm 63 degrees in the Washington DC area. And then you have the instant MPGs. And this bike does get pretty decent gas mileage. In the middle, you have your speedometer, and it reads 180 miles per hour. This bike does go 150 miles per hour and plus, depending on the models. That's why this bike is considered a hyper sports touring bike. What you have to do is hit start, and the bike comes to life. have is the electric windshield. This is I believe it's a C. Bailey windscreen. That's the highest, and then this is the lowest. I appreciate that this windscreen is very simple. All the mechanical parts are right here. You can remove the windscreen with just a few bolts. That is awesome. I like that. Now here's something very interesting about the FJR. When you turn off the bike and it's at the highest position of the windscreen, it goes down by itself. Now that is pretty amazing, but it's kind of useless on a motorcycle. I never felt that I needed to put my windscreen down on any motorcycle when I was parking, because then I have to put it back to where I want it. But it's not that big of a deal. It is a nice feature, but it's kind of like a little on the quirky side, and I don't think it's really needed. But I guess maybe there is a way to control it. I don't know. Write down in the comments below if there's a way to stop that. Left side, you have a slot to put your key, and that is opening up your seat. So you turn it and you lift up on the seat. With the seat, the rear passenger seat replaced. To remove the driver's seat, there is a switch here, which is a little bit more difficult to see than most people would expect. And you turn it this way and lift up on the seat, and you can remove the rider's seat. This is a particularly interesting thing. This bike does have an adjustable seat height, high and low. But the way you do it is you have this piece of plastic, and this is the same way that the Yamaha Super Tenere, for example, have. And you can just move this backwards or front, and it goes into these notches. So you have a high and a low. So if you would like a lower seating position, move it backwards. If you want a higher position, move it to the front. I like a higher position. This is a brilliant way of doing it. Yamaha decided to keep the narrowness of this bike slim. So when you sit on it, it feels like you're sitting on top of it rather than in it. Some other bikes feel like everything is around you. At SD1300, for example, you're in the bike. This one, you're on top of it. It's very narrow compared to those particular bikes. Sitting on this bike, very neutral. It's a very comfortable riding position. The ergonomics are excellent on it. It's also very narrow. The mirrors give you just about everything that you need. They're not perfect, but they create a lot of vibration dampening. And the fairing here does go outside of your knee, so the wind does go around you, but you do get bombarded a little bit more on the sides than you would on an SD1300. This bike does give you a little bit more of a feeling of going fast because of its sporty nature. Bike, I could ride this for 500 miles and I'm not really going to feel a thing about it. And it gets better gas mileage than a lot of the competition, which is strange because you have an extremely powerful bike. Put it on the center stand. Some motorcycles are much harder to put on the center stand than others. The Super Tenere I had was one of the hardest. But on this one, you just put it in the middle, you push down on the center stand, and you see like I can put my entire weight and then pull back. Very easy to put on the center stand. Got this very ugly seam here, and that's just from the seat hitting this. So let's take this bike out for a ride and see how she rides. Is pretty much instant on this bike. The mirrors are not as good as some other bikes, but you can see everything behind you. There's no vibration coming through the mirrors. They do have only 5 gears, but it makes you wonder why anybody needs 6 gears when this bike is so capable. On the highway at regular speeds, if you're in 5th gear, you always have the power to accelerate and get out of the way of anybody. Like, this thing's got so much power in like the top gear, and that makes it much more usable in everyday conditions. You're definitely not as comfortable as you are on the ST1300, but on this bike, I think it takes a little bit more self-control. These like little turns, it's definitely not what it's meant for. It feels steadier going at higher speeds. It's got a surge around 4,000 RPMs. So first gear is definitely very powerful to go around corners. And the throttle is just so abrupt. So abrupt. It's more so than the Super Tenere. I don't know why Yamaha just doesn't sort this out. Even in the early bikes, why can't you just sort out your fuel injection? It's like you have to constantly be on the throttle in order for the suspension and stuff not to get upset. Yeah, this bike just kind of seems to prefer very steady throttle inputs around the corner. And it's definitely clunky. Jesus, and it just calls so much attention. Third gear pull. Oh my God. Here's the reality of the FJR, especially for commuting. This is the speed you're going to be going. And this bike is torturous to ride at this speed. Here just seems so low. Just all over the place. In these rougher roads, it feels like the engine is way more powerful than the suspension. Drifting is just so clunky. So clunky. The faster you go, the clunkier it gets. Speed, and it just feels unstable compared to the ST. The ST having the weight down low, like this thing just wants to like stand up, and it's got so much power that it feels, hey, that was ice on the road. It feels just, oh my God, it lifts up the front wheel, it just skips. That is the Yamaha FJR1300. This is the second generation of the FJR. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.